I was watching national news and they were sharing on some of the things from the Tulsa, Tulsa massacre, which happened over 100 years ago. It just made me get real contemplative and a tad bit reflective on not forgetting some of the battles and the scraps that we have in our past. While we all long to move on to the bigger, the better, and the greater, some of the lessons from the past are so vital to keep close to heart. I was my grandmother's first child. I'm my grandmother's first grandchild. My parents grew up in Memphis. Well, my mother and her siblings grew up along with my grandfather. They grew up, they were raised in a place called the Foot Homes. I had a great, that's a public housing complex. I had a great aunt that stayed in the Claiborne Homes. And then I had another aunt that stayed in Lemoyne Gardens. All were public housing facilities. It's amazing how soon we can forget. So I'm old enough to remember that because being the first grandchild, I became my grandmother's shadow. So wherever she went, I went, and my grandmother was going to see her sisters. Although I never personally stayed in the projects, my mother was reared there. My grandmother went to visit her sister in one and then went to visit another sister in another. So I grew up with people in my life that were from the Claiborne Homes, the Foot Homes, and Lemoyne Garden. As a matter of fact, on that last one, the Lemoyne Garden, there's still people to this day that think that I grew up in Lemoyne Garden. And we stayed pretty close to there, but I never actually was a resident there. But I have. Some people have given me my Lemoyne Garden card. And what I saw there were in each of those communities, and even in my own, were people that didn't have a pretty Genesis. But God never promised us necessarily a pretty Genesis. But I've seen many go on to some super exciting exoduses. So you can still be proud because what I saw in each one of those places were brilliant people that had a fight against debilitating economic stress. Didn't mean that they were any less brilliant. I found good people there just like you can find good people sometimes on Wall Street. But what I did see in those people were that they had the ability to fight. I never forgot those lessons. I never forgot the resiliency. I never forgot uh, the fight that people there had just to survive. So sometimes learning how to be a survivor needs to be treasured. I value those lessons. I don't look down my nose in retrospect. I wouldn't trade my place growing up, how I grew up, with those who grew up with the creme de la creme, who grew up eating caviar and everything else. There are lessons that I still remember of the resiliency and those people's fight to survive. And those people, I'm not pointing them out because they're my people. My people stayed there. So look, never allow people to shortchange you on your own personal history. Never allow people to rob you of the best of the stories of the places that you came from. In the Old Testament, the words are posed, who have despised the day of small things. God never promised any of us a pretty Genesis. But it's my belief that many people that came from those super adverse circumstances will have unbelievable exodus that will have. That's the problem now in places all over this land. We have gleamings and inklings of success, but success in some communities needs to be quite a bit more pervasive. So I'm looking forward to the day when many of us who didn't have a pretty Genesis will have that thing of beauty called an overwhelming exodus, not an overwhelming exodus, overwhelming exodus. I believe that God has bigger, better, and grander. I think that because you didn't faint a long time ago, you suffered, you could have given up a long time ago, and I think that your faithfulness over a few in your Genesis will see you become a ruler over many in your Exodus. Never allow people to make you ashamed of your Genesis. Your Genesis had most times nothing to do with you. They may come from pedigree, they may come from excellence, they may come from status, but God doesn't promise that just because you had a pretty Genesis that you'll have a pretty Exodus. Pharaoh had an awesome Genesis, but Pharaoh didn't do so good over in the book of Exodus. So latter parts of the book of Genesis and some of the parts of Exodus. Look, just because you have a pretty Genesis, you had an adverse Genesis, doesn't mean that your Exodus won't be a thing of beauty. You couldn't handle where you came from. You can't control where you came from. But I'm more in the mindset that it's not where you're from, but it's where you're going. And I believe that you're going to a powerful place. Be blessed. Have an awesome day.